I was only 7 years old when I discovered something in that narrow alley behind our apartment building that would change my life forever. The image is still burned into my memory. A German shepherd, once magnificent and proud, now cowering in the shadows with silver duct tape wrapped tightly around his muzzle. His eyes, dark and desperate, met mine through the dim morning light, and in that moment, I knew I had to act fast. The dog's ribs were showing through his matted fur, and his breathing was labored and panicked. Someone had done this to him. Someone had deliberately silenced this beautiful creature and left him to suffer alone. As I stood there, frozen by the horror of what I was seeing, I had no idea that my next actions would not only save his life, but teach our entire neighborhood about the power of compassion. Speech balloon, I'd love to know. What time is it where you are right now, and which city or state are you watching from? My name is Marcus, and I need to tell you this story because it's been 23 years since that morning, and I still think about it every single day. It happened in the summer of 2001, in a small town in Ohio called Millfield, where everyone knew everyone, and bad things weren't supposed to happen to innocent animals. But as I learned that day, cruelty can hide in the most unexpected places, and sometimes it takes a child's pure heart to see what adults have trained themselves to ignore. I was the kind of kid who collected stray cats and begged my mom to let me keep every injured bird I found. Our small apartment was already home to 3 rescued cats. Whiskers, who had been found as a kitten in a storm drain, Patches, who was missing her left eye from an untreated infection, and Shadow, a black Tom who had shown up on our fire escape one winter night, half frozen and starving. We also had 2 hamsters named Peanut and Butter, and a goldfish named Sparkles that I'd won at the county fair by throwing rings onto milk bottles. My mother, Sarah, worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat after my father left when I was 5. She cleaned offices downtown from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, then came home just long enough to get me ready for school before heading to her day job at Murphy's Diner on Main Street. She was tired most of the time. Her hands were always red and chapped from cleaning chemicals, and I could see the worry lines growing deeper around her eyes with each passing month. But she never said no when I brought home another creature that needed help. She would sigh sometimes, counting the money in her purse and calculating the cost of another bag of cat food or a trip to the veterinarian. But then she would look at whatever broken animal I had carried through our door, and her expression would soften. "We can't save them all, Marcus," she would say quietly, "but I guess we can save this one." Our apartment was on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian house that had seen better days. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners, the linoleum in the kitchen was cracked and yellowed, and the radiators clanged all night during the winter. But it was home, and more importantly, it was a place where lost and broken things could find safety. That particular morning, July 15th, 2001, I woke up earlier than usual. The summer heat was already creeping through our thin walls, and our ancient window air conditioning unit was making a grinding noise that meant it was about to give up completely. I could hear the familiar sounds of our neighborhood stirring to life. Mrs. Patterson next door was watering her garden, talking to her tomato plants like they were old friends. The ice cream truck was making its first rounds 3 blocks away, playing that tinkling melody that would haunt my dreams all summer. And somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking, but not the normal, happy bark of a pet playing in the yard. This was different. This was a sound of distress, muffled and desperate, like someone was crying through a pillow. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet touching the cool hardwood floor. Through the thin wall, I could hear Mrs. Chen's baby crying, and the sound of running water as someone upstairs took a shower. Normal sounds of people starting their day. But that other sound, that muffled whimpering, was cutting through everything else like a knife. My mom was still sleeping on the couch, her uniform draped over the back of a chair, her work shoes kicked off by the door. She had worked a double shift at the diner the night before, covering for someone who had called in sick, and I could see the exhaustion etched into her face even in sleep. Her dark hair was spread across the pillow, and there were still creases on her cheek from where she had fallen asleep with her head on her arm. I grabbed my sneakers from beside the door and quietly let myself out of our second-floor apartment, following the sound that had pulled me from sleep. The morning air was thick with humidity, the kind that makes your clothes stick to your skin before you've even started moving. The smell of garbage from the dumpsters mixed with the sweet scent of honeysuckle that grew wild along the fence line. And somewhere a mockingbird was cycling through its repertoire of stolen songs. I could hear that muffled whimpering more clearly now, and it was coming from the narrow alley that ran between our building and the old brick warehouse next door. This alley was where the maintenance crew stored extra supplies, paint cans and ladder sections and coils of rope that always smelled like tar. It was also where sometimes homeless people would sleep when the weather was bad, leaving behind empty bottles and makeshift cardboard shelters. It wasn't a place where kids were supposed to go alone, especially not at dawn when the shadows were still long and dark. But that sound, that desperate, muffled crying, it was pulling me forward like a magnet. Every instinct I had developed from years of rescuing injured animals was screaming that something was in terrible trouble, and I was the only one who could hear it. I turned the corner into the alley, and that's when I saw him. At first, I thought it might be a pile of old rags, or maybe a garbage bag that had been torn open by raccoons. The morning light was still gray and uncertain, and the shadows played tricks with my eyes. But then I saw the movement, the rise and fall of labored breathing, and I realized I was looking at a dog. A large German shepherd with golden and black fur that was matted with dirt and something that looked like dried blood. The silver duct tape wrapped around his muzzle caught the early morning light, and I could see that it had been wound around multiple times, sealing his mouth completely shut. The tape was the cheap, shiny kind that hardware stores sell in bulk, and whoever had applied it had pulled it tight enough that it was cutting into the fur around his snout. His eyes were wide with fear and exhaustion, and when he saw me, he tried to lift his head but seemed too weak to hold it up for long. The concrete beneath him was stained with urine and what looked like vomit, and I could see that he had been trying to scratch at the tape with his front paws, leaving raw marks on his snout where his claws had scraped against his own skin in desperation. His tongue, what little I could see of it pressed against the tape, was starting to turn a grayish color that even my 7-year-old brain recognized as dangerous. I had never seen anything so cruel in my 7 years of life. The sight of this magnificent animal, reduced to suffering in silence, made my chest tight with a feeling I couldn't yet name. It was rage mixed with heartbreak, the kind of emotion that makes you want to scream and cry at the same time. It was the feeling of seeing something so fundamentally wrong that it shakes your faith in the basic goodness of the world. The dog's breathing was getting more labored, and I could see that his whole body was trembling. Not from cold, because the morning was already warm, but from exhaustion and fear and the effort of trying to get enough oxygen through his nose alone. His ribs were clearly visible through his matted coat, and I could see that he hadn't eaten in days, maybe longer. Even at 7 years old, I knew that this meant he was in serious trouble. He was slowly suffocating, and whoever had done this to him had left him here to die. I approached slowly, my hands shaking. The dog's eyes followed my movement, and I could see intelligence there, along with the fear. He wasn't aggressive. He was just terrified and in pain. His ears, which should have been standing tall and alert, were flattened against his head, and his whole body was pressed low against the concrete as if he were trying to disappear. I knelt down beside him, and up close, I could see that he was actually quite young, maybe 2 or 3 years old. His collar was gone, and there was a raw mark around his neck where it had been, as if someone had ripped it off violently. The fur there was rubbed away, and I could see the pink skin underneath, irritated and sore. "Hello, boy," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "I'm going to help you, okay?" I'm going to get that tape off your face. The dog's eyes never left mine as I examined the tape more closely. It had been wrapped around his muzzle at least 4 times, and whoever had done this had pulled it tight with each layer. The edges were starting to cut into his skin, and I could see that trying to remove it quickly might hurt him even more. But he was running out of time. His breathing was becoming more and more distressed, and his body was starting to convulse slightly from the lack of oxygen. I looked around the alley, hoping to see someone who could help, but it was still early, and this part of the neighborhood was quiet. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic on the main road, and the chirping of birds in the oak tree that shaded the far end of the alley. I knew I had to act, but I also knew I needed to be careful. In my pocket, I had a small Swiss Army knife that my grandfather had given me for my birthday 3 months earlier. It was red with a white cross on it, and it had belonged to him when he was in the army during World War II. My mom didn't know I carried it, but I felt grown up having it, and I had used it to help injured animals before, cutting fishing line from a duck's leg, opening a can of food for a stray cat, things like that. I pulled out the knife and opened the smallest blade, which was sharp and precise. The dog's eyes widened when he saw it, and I could feel him tense up. But I kept talking to him in a soft voice, telling him that I was there to help, that I wasn't going to hurt him. I reached out slowly and placed my free hand on his head, feeling the warmth of his fur and the slight tremor that ran through his body. "It's going to be okay," I promised him, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. "I'm going to be really careful, and I'm going to get you free." Working with the knife, I began to carefully cut through the layers of tape. The dog held perfectly still, as if he understood that I was trying to help him. It was remarkable, really. Here was an animal who had clearly been abused and abandoned, who had every reason to distrust humans, and yet he was allowing a strange child to approach him with a blade. The tape was thick and stubborn, designed to stick to anything and hold tight. I had to work slowly to avoid cutting him, angling the blade away from his skin and sawing through each layer with tiny, precise movements. My hands were shaking with adrenaline and fear, but I forced myself to focus on the task. One layer, then another, then another. As I worked, I started talking to him about everything I could think of. I told him about my cats at home, about how Whiskers liked to sleep in the bathroom sink, and how Patches could catch flies with her one good eye better than most cats could with 2. I told him about my mom, and how she always said that animals could sense when people had good hearts. I told him about the time I had found a baby bird with a broken wing, and how we had nursed it back to health in a shoebox lined with soft towels, feeding it with an eyedropper every 2 hours until it was strong enough to fly away. I think I was talking as much to calm myself as to comfort him, but his breathing seemed to steady a little as he listened to my voice. His eyes never left my face, and I could see something changing in them. The wild fear was still there, but underneath it, I thought I saw the beginning of trust. Layer by layer, I cut through the tape. Each piece came away with a soft ripping sound, and I could see the relief in the dog's eyes as the pressure around his muzzle lessened bit by bit. When I finally got to the last piece, the one that was directly against his fur and skin, I paused. This was the part that was going to hurt the most, because the adhesive had stuck to his fur and the tender skin around his mouth. But I could see that his gums were turning blue, and I knew we were out of time. "I'm sorry, boy," I whispered. "This is going to hurt, but then you'll be able to breathe." I worked the knife under the final layer of tape and cut it, then began to gently peel it away from his fur. The dog whimpered softly as the tape pulled at his skin, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. But he didn't try to pull away or snap at me. He just looked at me with those trusting, desperate eyes and let me help him. When the last piece of tape came free, the dog's mouth opened and he took a huge, gasping breath. Then another, and another. The sound of his breathing, finally unrestricted, was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of life returning, of hope being restored, of suffering finally ending. He lifted his head and looked at me, and I swear I saw gratitude in his eyes. His tail, which had been tucked tight against his body, gave a small, tentative wag. He tried to lick my hand, but his mouth was too dry and his tongue too swollen from the ordeal. But our relief was short-lived. As I sat back on my heels, looking at the pile of silver tape beside us and feeling proud of what we had accomplished together, I heard footsteps coming toward the alley. Heavy footsteps, and they were moving fast. The dog heard them too, and I felt his body tense up again under my hand. He tried to get to his feet, but he was too weak and collapsed back down onto the concrete. The footsteps got closer, and then I heard a voice. A man's voice, angry and slurred with alcohol. "Where'd that damn dog go? I know he's around here somewhere. When I find him, I'm gonna teach him a lesson he won't forget." My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I looked down at the German Shepherd, and I could see the terror returning to his eyes. He knew that voice, and he was afraid of it. I realized that whoever was coming was probably the person who had done this to him, and they were looking for him. The dog was trying to make himself smaller, pressing his body against the concrete and looking around desperately for somewhere to hide. But there was nowhere to go. The alley was narrow, with brick walls on both sides and no other exits except the way we had come in, and the far end that opened onto the parking lot behind the warehouse. I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of running away, which would have been the smart thing for a 7-year-old to do, I positioned myself between the dog and the entrance to the alley. I was small, just a skinny kid in pajamas and sneakers, but I was determined. No one was going to hurt this animal again, not while I was there to protect him. The man appeared at the mouth of the alley, and I could see immediately that he was drunk. He was tall and thin, with greasy hair that hung in strings around his face, and clothes that looked like he had been wearing them for days. His eyes were bloodshot and wild, and when he saw me kneeling beside the dog, his face twisted into an ugly expression of rage. "Get away from my dog, kid," he snarled, stumbling toward us. The smell of alcohol hit me like a wave, mixed with the stench of unwashed clothes and something else. Something mean and bitter that seemed to come from inside him. "That animal is nothing but trouble. Bit my neighbor's kid, so I was teaching him a lesson." Even at 7 years old, I knew he was lying. The dog beside me was gentle and scared, not aggressive. His whole body language spoke of submission and fear, not violence. And even if he had bitten someone, which I doubted, taping his mouth shut and leaving him to suffocate was not a lesson. It was torture. I stood up, my legs shaking, but my voice steady. "He's not your dog anymore," I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. "You hurt him, and now he's going to stay with me." The man laughed, but it wasn't a nice sound. It was harsh and mean, like the sound a crow makes when it's defending a piece of roadkill. "Kid, you don't know what you're talking about. That dog is dangerous, and I'm going to take him to the pound where he belongs. Or maybe I'll just finish what I started right here." He took another step toward us, and I could see that he had something in his hand, another roll of duct tape. The sight of it made my stomach turn, because I realized he hadn't just been trying to silence the dog. He had been planning to come back and finish killing him. The dog tried again to get to his feet, and this time he managed to stand, though he was swaying slightly. He moved to stand beside me, and I felt his warm body against my leg. We were both afraid, but we were facing this together. That's when I did something that surprised even me. I started yelling at the top of my lungs. "Help!" I screamed, my voice echoing off the brick walls of the alley and carrying into the morning air. "Someone help us! This man hurt a dog, and he's trying to kill him." My voice cracked with fear and adrenaline, but it was loud. Loud enough to wake people up, loud enough to bring help. The man's face went pale, and he looked around nervously. He hadn't expected me to make noise, and he obviously didn't want other people to see what was happening. "Shut up, you little brat," he hissed, reaching toward me with one hand while gripping the roll of tape with the other. But my screaming had worked. I could hear doors opening in the apartments above us, and footsteps running toward the alley. The first person to arrive was Mrs. Patterson, our neighbor, still wearing her bathrobe and house slippers, carrying a cordless phone in one hand. "What's going on here?" she demanded, looking back and forth between me, the dog, and the drunk man. Her gray hair was still in curlers, and her face was flushed from running, but her voice was strong and authoritative. Behind her came Mr. Rodriguez from the corner apartment, wearing a tank top and jeans that he had obviously thrown on quickly. He was a big man who worked construction, and when he saw the drunk man with a roll of tape, his expression darkened. Then came Mrs. Chun from the first floor, carrying her baby and looking worried. Mr. and Mrs. Williams from across the hall. Old Mr. Murphy who ran the corner store. Within minutes, the narrow alley was filled with people, all asking questions and trying to understand what was happening. I pointed to the pile of silver tape on the ground, the pieces I had cut away from the dog's muzzle. "This man taped this dog's mouth shut and left him here to die," I said, my voice still shaking with adrenaline. "I cut the tape off so he could breathe, and now the man wants to take him back to hurt him more." The crowd turned to look at the drunk man, and I could see the disgust and anger in their faces as they took in the scene. The obviously abused dog, the pile of tape, the roll of fresh tape in the man's hand. The man started backing toward the street, muttering something about the dog being his property and how kids should mind their own business. When Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward and suggested they call the police, the man turned and ran, stumbling down the alley and disappearing around the corner. We never saw him again, but I sometimes wonder if he found other animals to hurt, other creatures who didn't have someone to speak for them. Mrs. Patterson knelt down beside me and the dog, and I could see that she was crying. "Oh, honey," she said softly, looking at the German shepherd who was now leaning heavily against my leg. "Look what someone did to this poor baby." The dog's breathing was still labored, and I could see that he was dehydrated and exhausted. His fur was matted and dirty, and there were small cuts on his face where the tape had been too tight. But his eyes were alert, and his tail gave a tiny wag when Mrs. Patterson reached out to pet him. Someone called the police and animal control, but while we waited for them to arrive, our neighbors did something beautiful. Mrs. Chun ran to her apartment and came back with a bowl of water and some leftover chicken from her dinner the night before. Mr. Rodriguez brought a soft blanket from his couch. Mrs. Patterson called her daughter, who was a veterinary technician at the clinic downtown, and asked her to come over and look at the dog. Mr. Williams, who was retired and had time to stay, sat down on the concrete and started talking to the dog in a gentle voice, telling him about his own German shepherd who had died the year before. The dog seemed to respond to the kindness in his voice, and his breathing started to slow down and become more regular. Within an hour, that narrow alley was transformed from a place of cruelty into a place of healing. The dog, who we learned was named Duke from a tag that had been hidden under his matted fur near his collar, drank water slowly and ate small pieces of chicken. He let Mrs. Patterson's daughter examine his injuries, and she determined that while he was dehydrated and traumatized, there were no serious physical injuries that wouldn't heal with proper care. The police arrived first, 2 officers who took pictures of the tape and wrote down everyone's account of what had happened. They were kind and professional, but I could see the anger in their eyes when they looked at the evidence of what had been done to Duke. One of them, Officer Martinez, knelt down beside Duke and let him sniff her hand. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, she said quietly, "and I still can't understand how someone could do this to an innocent animal." The animal control officer was a kind woman named Janet who had been working with abused animals for over 20 years. She took one look at Duke and shook her head in disgust, but her voice was gentle when she spoke to him. "I've seen a lot of cruelty in my time," she said, "but this is one of the worst cases I've encountered. This dog could have died from suffocation or stress. Whoever did this should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." But there was a problem. Since we had no way to identify the man who had abused Duke, and since he had run away before the police arrived, there was no one to prosecute. The bigger issue was what would happen to Duke now. Animal control would take him to the shelter, where he would be held for a mandatory waiting period in case his owner came forward to claim him. But shelters in our area were overcrowded, and a traumatized dog like Duke might not have a good chance of being adopted. Large dogs, especially ones with behavioral issues from abuse, often ended up being euthanized when the shelters ran out of space. I looked down at Duke, who was now lying on Mr. Rodriguez's blanket with his head resting on my leg. He had been through so much, and the thought of him being locked in a cage at the shelter after everything he had endured made my chest tight with worry. That's when my mom arrived. She had woken up to find me gone, and had followed the sound of voices to the alley. When she saw me sitting on the ground with a German shepherd in my lap, surrounded by police officers and animal control, her face went through about 5 different emotions in the span of 10 seconds. "Marcus Anthony Thompson," she said, using my full name, which meant I was either in big trouble or she was really scared. "What on earth is going on here?" I told her the whole story, from hearing the muffled whimpering to cutting the tape to facing down the drunk man. As I talked, I watched her face change from worry to anger to something that looked like pride. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, just looking at me and Duke. Then she turned to Janet, the animal control officer. "What happens to him now?" she asked. Janet explained about the shelter and the waiting period, but I could see the concern in her eyes. She had been doing this job long enough to know that Duke's story might not have a happy ending at the shelter. Traumatized dogs often didn't do well in the stressful environment of a shelter, and if Duke became too scared or aggressive from the experience, he might never be adoptable. That's when my mom did something that changed our lives forever. "We'll take him," she said simply. "If no one claims him after the waiting period, we'll adopt him." I looked up at her with my mouth open. We lived in a small apartment. We didn't have a lot of money, and we already had 3 cats. Taking in a large dog would be a big responsibility, and my mom had every reason to say no. But she looked down at Duke, who had lifted his head to look at her with those intelligent, grateful eyes, and I saw her expression soften. "He saved this dog's life," she said, nodding toward me. "The least we can do is give him a safe place to heal." The waiting period was the longest 2 weeks of my life. Duke was held at the county animal shelter, but Janet arranged for us to visit him every day. The shelter was a sad place, filled with the sounds of barking and whimpering, the smell of disinfectant and fear. Duke was kept in a kennel in the back, away from the other dogs, because the staff wasn't sure how he would react to being around other animals. When we visited, Duke would press himself against the front of his kennel and whine softly when he saw us coming. He was getting medical care and proper food, and his physical condition improved quickly. But I could see that he was still traumatized. He flinched when people moved too quickly, and he wouldn't eat if there were too many people around making noise. The only time he seemed truly calm was when I was sitting with him, talking to him in the same soft voice I had used that morning in the alley. During those 2 weeks, our entire neighborhood rallied around Duke's story. Mrs. Patterson organized a collection to help pay for his veterinary bills, going door to door with a coffee can and explaining what had happened. By the end of the first week, she had collected over $400 from our neighbors. Mr. Rodriguez, who was a carpenter, offered to build a doghouse for our small balcony. He spent his weekend measuring and cutting wood, creating a beautiful little house with Duke's name painted on the front in blue letters. Mrs. Chun started cooking extra portions of chicken and rice, insisting that Duke needed to gain weight and that homemade food would be better for him than the kibble from the shelter. But the most surprising support came from my school. When I told my second-grade teacher, Miss Williams, about what had happened, she asked if I would be willing to share Duke's story with the class. I was shy about speaking in front of people, but I felt like Duke's story needed to be told. The day I spoke to my class about animal cruelty and the importance of helping creatures that couldn't help themselves, something amazing happened. My classmates were so moved by Duke's story that they organized a fundraiser. They sold lemonade and cookies at lunch, and they collected donations from their parents. By the end of the week, they had raised over $300 for Duke's care. The story spread beyond our school. My teacher called the local newspaper, and they sent a reporter to interview me and my mom. The article that appeared on the front page of the weekend edition was titled, "7-Year-Old Hero Saves Abused Dog." And suddenly people from all over town were calling to offer help. A local veterinarian named Dr. Sarah Kim called to offer Duke's medical care for free. A pet store donated food, toys, and everything else we would need. Most importantly, several people called to offer Duke a home if we couldn't keep him. But by then, Duke had already found his home with us. When the 2-week waiting period ended and no one had claimed him, which didn't surprise anyone, we officially adopted Duke. The paperwork was simple, but the moment felt huge. Janet smiled as she handed us Duke's leash and his new collar, which had our address and phone number on a shiny metal tag. The day we brought him home to our apartment, Duke walked through the door like he had always belonged there. He sniffed around carefully, introduced himself to our 3 cats with polite curiosity, and then settled down on the rug in our living room with a deep, contented sigh. Whiskers, our oldest cat, was the first to approach him. She walked right up to Duke and touched her nose to his, and from that moment, they were friends. Patches and Shadow took a little longer to warm up to him, but within a few days, I would often find all 4 of them sleeping in a pile on the living room rug. That first night, Duke slept on the floor beside my bed on a pile of old blankets. But sometime during the night, I woke up to find him pressed against my bed, his head resting on my mattress. I reached down to pet him, and his tail thumped softly against the floor. "Thank you," I whispered into the darkness. "Thank you for trusting me to help you." Duke's recovery was gradual but steady. For the first few weeks, he was startled by loud noises and sudden movements. He had nightmares sometimes, whimpering and pawing at his face in his sleep, as if he were still trying to remove the tape. When this happened, I would get out of bed and sit with him on the floor, talking to him until he calmed down. But slowly, with patience and love, he began to heal. He learned that the sound of the can opener meant good things were coming, not something to be afraid of. He discovered that our small balcony was a safe place to sit in the sun and watch the birds in the oak tree. He realized that when people raised their voices, it was usually because they were happy or excited, not angry. The breakthrough came about a month after we adopted him. I was sitting on the floor doing my homework, and Duke was lying nearby, watching me with those intelligent eyes. One of my pencils rolled under the couch, and when I got down on my hands and knees to retrieve it, Duke suddenly jumped up and barked, a full, joyful bark that filled our small apartment with sound. It was the first time I had heard his voice since that morning in the alley, and it was beautiful. From that day forward, Duke became a different dog. He was still gentle and calm, but he was also playful and curious. He learned to play fetch with a tennis ball on our small balcony, carefully catching it before it could bounce off the railing and fall to the yard below. He discovered that he loved to chase the cats around the apartment, though he was always careful never to actually catch them. He also learned to be my shadow. Wherever I went, Duke was right behind me. When I did my homework, he lay beside my chair. When I watched television, he pressed against my leg on the couch. When I took a bath, he lay on the bathroom floor, keeping guard. But the most remarkable thing about Duke was his intuition about people. It was as if his experience with cruelty had given him a special ability to sense when someone was in distress. He became our neighborhood's unofficial therapy dog, somehow knowing exactly when someone needed comfort. When Mrs. Patterson's husband died the following winter, Duke seemed to sense her grief. He would sit quietly beside her when she was in her garden, not asking for attention, just being present. When she cried, he would gently rest his head on her knee, offering the kind of comfort that only animals can give. When the little girl across the hall was sick with pneumonia, Duke would lie outside her door, as if he were standing guard. Her mother told us later that having Duke there made her daughter feel safer and helped her sleep better. And when I was having a particularly hard day at school, dealing with bullies or struggling with a difficult test, Duke would meet me at the door with a special gentleness, pressing his head against my leg and looking up at me with those knowing eyes. As the months passed, Duke's story continued to inspire people in our community. The newspaper article had been picked up by other publications, and soon we were getting letters from people all over the country who had been moved by the story of the 7-year-old boy and the rescued German Shepherd. But the most meaningful response came from a group of elementary school students in California who had read about Duke. They organized their own fundraiser and sent us a package containing hundreds of dollars, along with a letter explaining that they wanted to help other animals who had been abused like Duke. That letter gave me an idea. I talked to my mom about starting a program at our school to teach kids about animal cruelty and how to help animals in need. She helped me write a proposal, and we presented it to the principal and the school board. They were so impressed that they agreed to let me start an after-school club called Duke's Defenders, a group dedicated to helping animals and educating other kids about responsible pet ownership. The club started with just 5 members, me, my best friend Tommy, and 3 other kids who loved animals. But it grew quickly as word spread about what we were doing. We organized fundraisers for the local animal shelter, created educational posters about animal care, and even started a pet food drive for families who were struggling financially. Duke became our mascot, and he would often visit the school to help us teach younger children about gentleness and compassion. He was perfect for this role, gentle enough that even the smallest kindergartners felt safe around him, but impressive enough that he commanded respect and attention. But perhaps the most important thing Duke's Defenders did was teach kids what to do if they encountered animal abuse. We learned about the warning signs of neglect and cruelty, how to safely approach an injured animal, and most importantly, how to get help from adults when they found an animal in distress. We created a simple checklist that kids could remember. Look, listen, learn, and love. Look for signs that an animal is in trouble. Listen to what the animal is trying to tell you through its behavior. Learn how to get help safely. And love means showing compassion, even when it's scary or difficult. Over the years, our little club helped save dozens of animals. There was the cat who had been abandoned in a parking lot during a snowstorm, found by a 3rd grader who remembered our lessons about hypothermia and knew to call for help immediately. There was the dog who had been hit by a car, discovered by a group of middle schoolers who knew to call animal control instead of trying to move him themselves. And there was the puppy who had been kept in a cage too small for his size, reported by a brave 10-year-old who had learned from Duke's story that sometimes helping animals means being willing to speak up against adults, even when it's scary. Each rescue reinforced the lesson that Duke had taught me that morning in the alley, that cruelty exists in the world, but compassion is stronger. That sometimes the most vulnerable creatures need someone to be their voice. And that even a child can make a difference when they choose to act with courage and kindness. Duke lived with us for 13 wonderful years. He grew old gracefully, his muzzle turning gray and his steps becoming slower, but his spirit never dimmed. He remained gentle and wise, a constant reminder of the power of second chances and the healing that comes from love. In his later years, He developed arthritis in his hips, and climbing the stairs to our apartment became difficult for him. So we moved to a small house with a yard, using the money my mom had saved from her years of hard work. Duke loved having his own space to roam, and he spent hours lying in the sunshine, watching the squirrels and birds that visited our bird feeder. He never lost his protective instincts. Even as an old dog, he would position himself between me and anything he perceived as a threat. When I brought home my first girlfriend when I was 16, Duke sat between us on the couch for the entire evening, making it clear that he was keeping an eye on things. When Duke passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 15, our entire neighborhood mourned. The local newspaper ran another article, this time about the dog who had touched so many lives and inspired a generation of children to be kinder to animals. Over 200 people attended his memorial service at the park where he had loved to play. We buried him in our backyard, under the oak tree where he had spent so many happy hours. Mrs. Patterson brought flowers from her garden, and the kids from Duke's Defenders each wrote a letter telling him how much he had meant to them. But Duke's legacy lived on through the countless animals that had been saved by kids who had learned from his story. Duke's Defenders had grown into a nationwide program, with chapters in schools across the country. We had created educational materials, training videos, and even a children's book about Duke's rescue that was used in schools to teach empathy and compassion. Today, 23 years after that morning in the alley, I work as a veterinarian specializing in animal rescue and rehabilitation. Every day, I see animals who have been abused, neglected, or abandoned, and I think about Duke. I think about the trust he showed me when I was just a 7-year-old boy with a small knife and a big heart. My clinic is called Duke's Place, and we specialize in helping animals who have been traumatized by abuse or neglect. We use gentle rehabilitation techniques, patient medical care, and lots of love to help these animals learn to trust again. I still live in the same small town in Ohio, though I've moved to a larger house with a big backyard. I share it with 3 rescue dogs, 2 cats, and whatever other animals need a temporary home while they wait for their forever families. My mom, now in her 60s, still helps me with the animals, and she still tells people about the morning when her 7-year-old son became a hero. But I don't think of myself as a hero. I think of Duke as the hero. The dog who taught me that courage comes in many forms, that kindness is always the right choice, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to walk away from someone who needs help. The alley where I found Duke has been cleaned up and turned into a small community garden. There's a bench there now, with a plaque that reads, "In memory of Duke, who taught us that compassion has no age limit." Sometimes I sit on that bench and remember that morning when everything changed, when a boy and a dog found each other in a place of darkness and chose to step into the light together. The piece of silver duct tape that I cut from Duke's muzzle all those years ago is still in my desk drawer, kept as a reminder of what cruelty looks like and why we must never stop fighting against it. But next to it is a photo of Duke in his later years, lying in a patch of sunlight in our backyard, his eyes peaceful and content. That photo reminds me of what love looks like: patient, healing, and transformative. It reminds me that even the most broken spirits can be mended with time and kindness. And it reminds me that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply show up for someone who needs us. If you're watching this and you've ever encountered an animal in distress, I want you to know that you have the power to help. You don't have to be big or strong or have special training. You just have to be willing to see suffering and choose to act with compassion. And if you're a child watching this, I want you to know that your age doesn't make your voice less important. Some of the bravest, most compassionate people I know are children who saw something wrong and decided to make it right. Duke's story didn't end that day in the alley when I cut the tape from his muzzle. It continued for 13 more years, filled with love, healing, and the kind of quiet heroism that happens when we choose kindness over indifference. The morning I found Duke, I thought I was saving his life. But the truth is, he saved mine. He taught me who I wanted to be, showed me the work I was meant to do, and gave me a purpose that has guided every day since. That's the real miracle of Duke's story. Not that a 7-year-old boy had the courage to help a suffering animal, but that a suffering animal had the grace to trust that boy with his life. In that moment of connection, both of our stories changed forever. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed in bed that morning, if I had ignored the sound of Duke's muffled cries for help. But then I remember that love has a way of finding us when we need it most. And now, whenever I hear about another animal being rescued, another child choosing courage over fear, another community coming together to help the vulnerable, I think about Duke. I think about how one act of kindness can ripple outward in ways we never imagined. That's Duke's legacy. Not just the life he lived after his rescue, but the lives he continues to touch through his story. Every time someone chooses to help rather than walk away, Duke's spirit lives on. The world is full of dark alleys where suffering hides in silence. But it's also full of people with the courage to step into those dark places and shine a light. It's full of 7-year-old boys with small knives and big hearts, ready to cut through the cruelty and set the captives free.